You're listening to Puma Podcast.
The bare minimum reef damage in the South China Sea is 21,000 acres by China and just 1,500 by Vietnam. So China has destroyed at least 15 times as much reef as Vietnam, a bit more than that. But we know that this is an undercount.
The Philippines and its neighbors are all too aware of Beijing's perilous actions in the South China Sea. One major concern is the damage the regional power has wrought on the sea's ecosystem. But a new report quantifies the extent of that damage, helping us grasp just how much the region has lost. I'm Bella Perez Rubio, Puma Podcast, and you're listening to Teka Teka News.
Hello, everyone. I'm Monica Sato. I am a research associate at the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. I was born and raised in the Philippines, so it's very nice to be back and talk about an issue that I'm, passionate about in my home country.
Part of AMTI's report used satellite imagery to assess the damage Chinese island building has caused in the South China Sea.
I want to explain why states dredge in the first place, and it's really to build their outposts and maritime entitlements in the South China Sea. And it's to support their sovereignty claims as well. However, it is considered the most detrimental to the environment. This is because it removes essential reef substructures and also incapacitates the reef's ability to repair itself over time. So, China mainly used both dredging and landfill between the years of 2013 and 2017. They used this method called cutter suction dredging, which is a method where these dredgers slice through the reef and the sediment that is collected is pumped through floating pipelines, and then the sediment is then deposited on areas targeted for landfill. To simplify it, I guess, just try to imagine a drill going through the reef. And this sediment will run off through other parts of the ocean, coating nearby marine life. So that includes plants, animals, anything within the vicinity of the area. And this is also damaging to the health of these marine creatures.
So exactly how much damage have these activities caused?
So when we totaled the number of reefs destroyed by both dredging and landfill, we found that China has actually destroyed 4,500 acres of reefs through dredging and landfill.
That acreage is more than 7 times the size of Bonifacio Global City.
Vietnam comes in second with 1,500 reefs destroyed. And Malaysia, the Philippines, and Taiwan barely scratch the surface. They contribute to less than 100 acres of destroyed reef. Now, another thing that we studied for this report is giant clam harvesting. Giant clam harvesting became popular in China between 2012 to 2015 because of their resemblance to elephant ivory. As we all know, elephant ivory is illegal to extract, and it's also protected by international law. Because it's so similar to ivory, it became very popular in Chinese statuary, jewelry, and was sold for very high prices. The most expensive processed giant clam was sold for about $106,000 US. While there was a crackdown by Chinese authorities in 2017, satellite image shows that this process continued up until 2019. Now, this process is a double whammy because giant clams are already vulnerable as a species. But what's more detrimental, actually, is the method of which it is extracted by these Chinese fishermen, mainly from the port of Tianmen. So what the fishermen from China do is they use specially made brass propellers, and the boat moves around in a semicircle on an anchor chain. And so this process will actually take decades, if not centuries, to recover. And this process is also very indiscriminate. It will dig up both live and dead clams or fossilized clams into the reef. So it is very detrimental. So, totaling the damage done by giant clam harvesting, we found that China has actually destroyed an extra 16,000 acres of reef using this method.
That brings the total coral reef damage caused by China's island building and clam harvesting to at least 21,000 acres. The reefs destroyed were enough to cover the city of Manila twice over, or half of Quezon City. We talk about food security after a quick break.
The second component of our report is on overfishing.
That's Gregory Poling, the voice you heard at the top of this episode. He directs the Southeast Asia Program and Maritime Transparency Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
And this helps explain why this issue of reef destruction is so important. I mean, of course, we should all be outraged by the loss of reef habitat and the loss of endangered species, giant clams. But it's particularly bad because it happens in the South China Sea. The South China Sea is the most productive fishing ground on Earth. Estimates are that it accounts for about 12% of global fish catch. It's a lot less than 12% of the ocean. And because so much of the fishing that happens by small-scale fishers from the Philippines and Vietnam, up to half of all the fishing boats on Earth may operate in the South China Sea. The fish catch in the South China Sea has been more or less flat since the 1990s. That's an indication of a badly overfished ecosystem. Because since the 1990s, fishing gear has continued to improve, technology has continued to improve, China has significantly increased the subsidies to its fishing fleet. There are more boats operating, and there's more money going into it, and yet the same amount of fish is coming out. Which means that countries are fishing down the seafood food chain. They are fishing species that wouldn't even have been worth it a few years ago. And I think most people know this anecdotally. If you go to a market anywhere in coastal Philippines or central Vietnam, what you find are juvenile fish and fish species that would have considered bait at best 30 years ago, because the other stuff isn't there anymore, or it's almost impossible to find. So you take this already badly stressed ecosystem that is the most productive and the most important for food security on Earth, and then you dig up 21,000 or more acres of reef on purpose over the last 10 years, where all those fish breed. It's an ecological disaster waiting to happen. The macro picture is really just a China and Vietnam picture. Bottom trawling is the most destructive fishing practice on Earth. And that's globally, not just in the South China Sea. You drag a weighted net across the ocean floor, scooping up everything in your path, including a whole lot of things that you're just going to throw back in after they die. China has been using bottom trawling in the South China Sea for decades. As it has around the world, it has the largest bottom trawling fleet on Earth. But Vietnam has rapidly taken up that technology and now trawls more in the South China Sea than China does. Overall fish catch, China is still number one in the South China Sea. China does a lot of other types of fishing, most especially falling net vessels that are used to catch things like squid. But Vietnam is closing the gap rapidly. And so this is continuing to overexploit this ecosystem, which has been overfished now for at least the last 30 years, and which has now been given the added stressor of damaging or destroying at least 20% of the reefs that we know of.
There's a catch, though. Like Filipinos, Vietnamese fisherfolk have long relied on this waterway to make a living. China has always had other options.
Now, here we need to make two important points about Vietnam and China. Yes, Vietnam is overfishing the South China Sea. But keep in mind, one, this is the only offshore fishery Vietnam has. China has the largest distant water fleet on Earth. Most of China's fish are caught in the Pacific Islands, or off the coast of Latin America, or off the coast of Africa. China doesn't need to fish the South China Sea. China chooses to fish the South China Sea. Vietnamese fishers have to fish the South China Sea or find some other line of work. Point two, Vietnam's problem of overfishing and IUU fishing.
That's illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing.
And IUU fishing in its neighbors' waters is a lack of state capacity. Vietnam has trouble monitoring its fishermen. It has trouble enforcing its fisheries laws. China has no problem with state capacity. China's fishers are overfishing the South China Sea because Beijing pays them to overfish the South China Sea. This is a choice made by Beijing to subsidize fishing in areas where no Chinese fishing boat would operate if the state didn't pay them. And the simplest evidence for that is the fact that from the end of World War II until the late 1980s, there is no record of Chinese fishing at either Bajo de Masinloc or anywhere in the Calayan Islands. They magically appeared at the end of the 80s after the Chinese government began to pay them very well to operate there.
That leaves us with an all too important and urgent question. What can we do?
This will be an unsatisfying answer, but it's the answer for all international legal problems. And at the end of the day, the only thing that compels any country on earth to follow international law is that it costs them too much not to. It costs them too much in diplomatic damage, in reputational damage, and economic damage. So, the only way to stop this is to convince Beijing to stop it. Any effort to physically prevent this is going to be hopeless. They've got a lot more boats than everybody else combined, and it's a lot of ocean to try to cover. So, we need to see an international coalition starting in Southeast Asia, led by the claimants, to better survey this damage, account for it. But the fact is that China has suffered very little reputational cost for this behavior, and that needs to change. And it can't just be the Philippines out there imposing the cost as it has for too many years now, largely, by itself and with outside partners. We need to see the rest of, at least the claimants within ASEAN, speak up.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Bella Perez Rubio. Pidoy Blanco edited this episode. Our executive producer is Jill Caro, and our senior news editor is Veronica Uy. If you found this episode interesting or useful, share it with a friend or two, and thanks for listening.